Hi, everyone. This is Mary Curick of Frontrunners Innovate. Welcome to another episode where we introduce you to someone who is helping to solve some of the world's problems, and really interesting and different, unique resource that I've tripped across here. And I'm just so glad that I did, because it immediately caught my attention. We have a lot of think tank types in our network in the Frontrunners League, lots of diplomats, lots of thought leaders. I was on two, speaking engagements earlier this morning with probably 30 each that all belong in think tanks. I'm sure they are in those. And this gentleman is Enrique. Help me again. I'm going to mess it up. I don't want to mess it up.
Enrique Mendizábal.
Mendizábal. I love that name. I'm going to remember it now. Enrique. Okay, Enrique. And Enrique is the founder of On Think Tanks, and he's out of Peru. And I'm not going to kind of give away all the secrets of all the different things that you do, but the fact that it says On Think Tanks lets you know a little bit. And that's what really got my attention. So I want to turn it over to Enrique and let him share a little bit about what brought him into the work that he's doing and what he's doing actually. But the hint here is basically it's almost like an advisory firm and an analytical firm, reviewing firm for think tanks, and everything think tank, everything think tank that you can think of with think tank. So welcome, Enrique, and thank you for giving us a little bit of your time today. So thank you. And let us know a little bit about what brought you into the world of think tanks.
No, thank you, and happy to join you. What brought me into the world of think tanks? I worked in think tanks before setting up On Think Tanks, and I worked in think tanks. When you are in a place, when you're within an organization, you often don't think about what you do. You just do it. This is the way we do things, and then just get on with it. But I was lucky to work in a think tank, in a program within a think tank, the Overseas Development Institute in London, and a program that studied the links between research and policy. So the focus of our research was, how is it that some policies are well-informed and other policies appear not to be well-informed? What's going on there? Mm-hmm. And one of the things that came up all the time is that there was this actor, this specific actor everywhere in the world, whether this was the UK or the US or Peru or Zambia or Indonesia, that was always present. And we could label them a think tank. They could label these actors think tanks. They're always different. They take different shapes and forms, but they fulfill similar functions of either generating or mobilizing evidence to inform policy decisions or public policy. And so I became quite interested in these organizations as a subject of study. And then the program I was working in and I was leading also had the mission to support organizations like these in the Global South. The Overseas Development Institute was an international development think tank, so they had that mission. And so when I left ODI at the end of 2010, I had already set up a blog on think tanks, which was about think tanks, right? I wanted to write about think tanks. I wanted to share information about think tanks. And at the time that I left, there were three big initiatives around the world. One was the Think Tank Initiative, which was a multi-donor initiative. It involved the British government, the Canadian government, Gates Foundation, Hewlett Foundation, and I think NORAD or some other funder. And they funded about 50 think tanks in Africa, Asia, and Latin America for about 10 years. Then the Think Tank Fund, which was an OSF, Open Society Foundations initiative in Europe, funded think tanks in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, the Western Balkans area. And then the Knowledge Sector Initiative in Indonesia, funded by the Australian government, was also funding think tanks. So around 2010, 2011, there was a lot of interest in the international development community for knowledge about think tanks. And we just happened to set up this space, this blog on think tanks, and one thing led to the other, and On Think Tanks became more than just a blog, right? It's now we call it a change hub. We have about 20 so associates, consultants that we work with. Many of them come from the world of think tanks. Others work in the field of evidence-informed policy. And if anything, the name On Think Tanks now is a little bit misleading, because we do a lot of work with foundations, We do a lot of work with research funders. We work with government. We work with NGOs, with universities, because our ultimate interest is that policy is better informed. And we think tanks are one very good way of achieving that objective.
So let me ask you this. I'm a government in somewhere in Africa that's, hurting right now, and all of them are, I think so. And, we're working on policies that have to do with education, let's just say. I would be smart if I would watch the think tanks around the subject matter in my region who are coming up with policies around education, and being able to create my own policies based on what they're telling me, because it's what they're telling me should be based on research, correct?
Yes. I mean, you'd be smart if you took what think tanks told you and analyzed it. You shouldn't just take whatever people tell you and just as at face value. And you would be smart if you considered different views and different opinions from different think tanks, not just think tanks in your own country. If you are in Zambia, you might want to call on PMRC and ZIPAR and ask them, what do you think about these things? And then you might get two different views. You might get a consensus between those two organizations. But you might also want to call on AERC in Kenya, which is a network of economists across Africa, or ASSET in Ghana, and ask them a little bit more about this subject matter. And you might want to look at what Brookings program on education is doing, and you might want to look at the Education's Outcomes Fund, for example. So I think smart governments need to think that they need to look for evidence in different places, different sources. The problem, of course, is that governments can be smart, but they are usually limited in terms of resources. But policymakers are busy dealing with day-to-day policy making. They're busy dealing with an increasing number of demands that now the public can make to them via Twitter or any other means. And so they need an ecosystem, right? They need a sort of support structure. And think tanks play a key role in providing an important part of that support structure, because they can filter out what's out there. They can search for it, they can filter it, they can choose what might be more relevant for Zambia, right? What might be relevant to the context of Zambia. They might test some of those ideas at a small scale in a village in Zambia, in a school in Zambia, in a district in Zambia. And then they might come up with their own ideas and their own recommendations and push them, share them with government or with the public. So they play that role, right? So that's, smart policymaker would say, well, I can't possibly look at everything that is being published on education, but let me talk to a few think tanks in Zambia, and let me see if I can help them, right? Help them do that job a lot better. Maybe I can talk to the FCDO or USAID or IDRCs and say, I'd like you to support more think tanks in Zambia. Or maybe they can talk to the Ministry of Finance and say, well, are there any ways in which you can make it easier for philanthropy or businesses to fund research in Zambia on these issues? So not just asking for evidence, but supporting the ecosystem where this evidence is going to be generated and communicated. That would be very smart.
Do you help them create that sort of ecosystem to find some of the resources, to understand how to utilize those resources? Because I do wonder if some areas, if they don't understand how to utilize those correctly, or if they're even utilizing them at all.
What we do is we sometimes provide advice to governments on aspects of the ecosystem, and we write about and we share our opinion about how to support the ecosystem. So we have been advocating on our website for a very long time for an ecosystem approach, a systems approach to this, right? What you have usually is foundations or funders that are supporting just think tanks, and they expect that stronger think tanks are going to be able to influence policy. But if you don't have strong civil services, if you don't have a strong media, if you don't have strong political parties, if you don't have strong NGOs, you know, the work that think tanks can do is going to be very limited. On their own, they're not going to succeed. We also advocate, for example, for investments in academia. There are parts in the world where we work where think tanks struggle to get good researchers. And, you know, it's just that, you know, there's probably just one university that is graduating, you know, potentially good researchers. Now they have to go and study a postgraduate degree somewhere else because locally there aren't enough options. And those that come back, you know, that are good, well, they end up either in the central bank or the Ministry of Finance, which is good. We want them there, right? We don't want to poach them. Or they are poached by the World Bank, international foundations, international NGOs. Think tanks, they're not going to be the first place to go because they're not going to be able to pay usually high salaries. And so if you want to get these great researchers or communicators, you end up having to pay a lot of salary. So again, we would advocate for a lot of investment in the human capital that think tanks need, and the whole ecosystem needs to be able to be, you know, effective and to make actual contribution. But for instance, we just did a project with in Peru. We've been working with the government of Peru, supported by the UK government through the Newton Fund. It's been managed by the British Council. And what we did is we designed a scientific advisory system for the government of Peru. So Peru doesn't have a scientific advisory system. So individual ministers or vice ministers or the president, you know, they may use evidence and they may reach out to science, but they'll do it in an ad hoc, personal way, right? If the president, like the one we have now, is a former scientist, you know, they might reach out to scientists. But what usually happens is that they're not, and they don't have those networks, and they don't have time. So there's nobody in their network of advisors to help them. So we're designing something that would facilitate these connections between policymaking and science. And within science, you have think tanks and research organizations.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking when you were talking about creating that ecosystem. I feel like there's a lot of governments out there that aren't making use of any, like you said, systems approach to finding the information that they need to have to make proper decisions. To that end, are you kind of looking to standardize any kind of processes for think tanks?
No, we are, I think, famously in our little world, anti-standardizations.
Okay.
And we tend to push back on like-for-like comparisons. Don't like rankings. We don't. One of the things I learned early on is that think tanks are unique, right? So if you look at the history of think tanks, even in the US, you know, think tanks set up in the 1920s, 1910s, 1920s, with a particular logic, of a new professional civil service with an interest in efficiency. They are going to be different. They have a different DNA than think tanks set up in the 1970s, which are more about ideological engagement, ideological positions. They have a different DNA. So you see the same different parts of the world. Some think tanks are more academic in nature. They are places where these great researchers, right, could not find a home in an efficient civil service or in a well-funded university or in even consultancy firms. They decided to set up think tanks, but they want to do academic research, and so they're more research leaning. And then you might find next door a think tank that is much more advocacy focused. It's more about an NGO type approach of using the research done somewhere else to advocate for change, right? To create new narratives, for example. So they're very different, and so they'll need different ways of managing themselves, and they'll need different business models. They'll need different skills, etc. There might be some similarities, of course, right? But we think that more than trying to create a particular standard structure for a think tank, we tend to advocate for certain principles like transparency. We think that think tanks need to be transparent in their sources of funding. We think that they have to be public. So we think think tanks need to try to inform policy in a way that is public, right? So, which sets them aside from a lobby.
Yeah.
We think that think tanks need to make sure that they are, even if they're ideological, which they should be transparent about, that they should draw from evidence as a big part of their argument, right? Not a small part, but a big part of the argument, but not the only part of the argument. That would set them apart from campaigning NGOs, etc. Right? So I think those are principles that we would recommend rather than structures that should be similar for everybody.
Well said. I like it. So from the standpoint of how a think tank would create a budget for themselves, depending on if they can get private funds, they can get grants, they can be university or government sponsored or supported. Seems like I see sometimes white papers that are being sold, online, and I assume they're coming from a think tank sort of operation. How else can they make money? Because researchers, like you said, they're probably not getting paid enough. But when you're getting a good one, you really want to, you're going to need to pay some decent salaries, especially to the admin who's running something like that, because they're going to have to travel a great deal, I would think. But tell me where else can they find those nooks and crannies of income that they can achieve?
Well, this is the big question that most think tanks have. So when we ask them, we talk to think tankers all the time, and we ask them what's top of your list of concerns. Funding is one of the biggest ones. Yeah. Even if you have an endowment. So the first one, the one that everybody wants, is endowments, right? Everybody wants a philanthropist to gift them, a big chunk of money. That happens, but not as often as one might think. And certainly in the global south, this is very rare. This is not something that you would expect. Right? Philanthropy is not as developed as it is in other parts of the world, and it's not as professional, to put it in this way. So there are philanthropists, but they usually manage their money more as a personal philanthropy rather than as a foundation or professional body. The second one would be programmatic funding of some sort. So not endowment, but a long-term support, which could be to the organization. Some foundations provide this, organizational grants, or program. So long-term funding to an actual program. A think tank says, this is what I want to work on. I want to work in education in Peru, education in West Africa, and then a funder, whether it's a regional funder or an international funder, comes in and says, I'll support this program in the long term.
Yeah.
Most think tanks, unfortunately, get money on a project by project basis, right? Yes. So these are consultancies, if you want. But the difference between the consultancy of a think tank and the consultancy of a consultancy would be that the think tank, there's an expectation the think tank will publish whatever comes out of this project. Right? So the contract is very similar to the contract that you get with a consultant, but it's really just funding a project, so project by project. In all these different types of fundings, think tanks need to make sure that they cover the direct costs of doing the work, but also all the other costs, right? The communications team costs, the networking costs, right? The office costs,
right?
Costs.
Yes,
exactly, right.
Yeah.
So, and this is something that think tanks struggle with. They often, they can get money for the project, but they struggle to get money for comms, right? So their funder might say, I'll pay for a paper on policy recommendations to reduce the to improve education outcomes in Zambia, but I won't pay for the communication of that policy policy paper. Right? Somebody else has to, and this is when think tanks start to struggle a little bit. Selling, sometimes they sell membership. So there are large organizations like the RSA that has a fellowship program of about 30,000 people. So that that's a significant part of their income comes from membership. Chatham House, Brookings, others have membership options. That is important, but I would not say it's a significant part of their income. And others sell books or events, but again, that's not significant. That never is significant because think tanks need to give away their work, right? Think tanks need to make sure that more people read their work, and they never quite have the readership of The Economist, right? They never quite have the readership of the Financial Times, so they can't really survive from that kind of of income. What I would say though is that most think tanks have a lot of funders. So there are many think tanks that get 1,000 from this one, 1,000 from another one, 5,000 from this one, and maybe 10 from this one, and they just make up this pool of funding that they need to survive. This is crowdfunding before we talked about crowdfunding.
Yeah.
And this is the reality for most think tanks. Yeah.
So the fundraising is just an ongoing situation.
It's ongoing and it's fundamental, but it's one of the, unfortunately, it's one of those skills that few think tanks have developed well. And that's why I think that is one of the reasons why it's such a struggle for them.
How many, just off the top of your head, and I know this is a statistic you might not have, but how many think tanks are there in the world that you're aware of that are legitimate think tanks that you're aware of?
So we have a directory called the Open Think Tank Directory,
okay.
ottd.onthinktanks.org. And in the Open Think Tank Directory, we have about 4,000 think tanks. And now these are organizations that we have data for. So at least the website we've checked, they exist. There might be some mistakes, but it's an open directory. People can enter the directory, they can download the data, they can upload their own data for their own organization. They can tell us this is wrong, please correct this. This is out of date, and they can update it. And yeah, we have about 4,000. There are, the database is, more complete in the US and in Europe, in Latin America and in Asia, in Africa. We have somewhat of a gap in China, but still there are quite a lot of think tanks in China that we have in the directory.
Are they curated by region or country or by some other means?
No, you can search by areas of interest or subject, like research areas. You can search by region and sub-regions. You can search by country. So you can if the objective of the directory is that if you are a funder looking for think tanks in a particular country, or you're a think tank looking for partners in a particular country, you can find them. But also that the data itself allows researchers who are interested in think tanks as a subject of their study to actually have data that they can use, and of course that they can then share with others that want to do similar research. So I am sure there are more than 4,000 think tanks, but I can tell you that there are at least 4,000 think tanks out there.
That's good to know. I had no idea there'd be that many. But
the key thing, Mary, is that there's no formal definition of the label, right? There's no legislation anywhere in the world that says this is a think tank, right?
Yeah, the definition that everybody uses.
There's an academic called Thomas Medved. He talks about the labeling. He says the labeling is a political exercise. So you will see Chatham House does not call itself a think tank. They call themselves a research center. Yeah. You will see think tanks in the Western Balkans right now not calling themselves think tanks, because think tanks, the label is associated with the Open Society Foundations, it's associated with George Soros, it's associated with what many of the leaders of that part of the world are trying to fight. They want to establish, they want to capture states, and they see these foundations as a roadblock. And so the think tanks are worried for their safety and the individuals working there. And so they rather stay away from that label, right? Many academic leaning think tanks in Latin America, this is a kind of anecdotal, but I think telling story. So in 2009, before the Think Tank Initiative was launched, which gave core funding to 50 think tanks around the world for 10 years. Many think tanks that I worked with would tell me, Enrique, we're not a think tank. We're not a think tank. We're a research center.
No money for us. We're not a think tank.
You guys are doing research to influence policy. Yes, but we don't like that label, they would say. But as soon as the Think Tank Initiative said, we have money for think tanks, they all raised their hand.
Yeah, no kidding.
So it's a political act as well, because you position yourself. You say, I am not academia, I am not an NGO, I am this, right? Or so it's an interesting.
I could see the gap or the border that people would put between themselves if they were academic or they're NGO, that one would not want to necessarily be labeled very much like the other. So, that's not all you do. You do a lot of stuff. And one of the things that I think is most interesting to me is that that you also put out an annual State of the Sector, you know, publication. And so I wanted to find out a little bit about that and also your think tank training that you do. So let us know a little bit about those types of things that you're up to.
Yeah, so we have a couple of flagship reports that come out. One will come out around July, August, and the other one comes out around April. The one coming out now is called the State of the Sector, and that draws from this directory that I mentioned, plus a survey that we conduct with a sample of think tanks. And it allows us to, say something about the sector. For instance, last year we looked at gender in the founding members and in the senior leadership of the organization. So for the think tanks that we have information of.
Okay, explain the sector, if you will. Define the sector that we're talking about.
Sorry?
Define the sector, if you will, that you're talking about.
So the think tanks around the world. So the 4,000 think tanks that I mentioned.
Okay, that's what you're, okay. I just want to make sure it was clear that you weren't talking about a geographic area. You're talking about.
No. So we looked at all of the think tanks.
Yeah.
And then we narrow down on certain geographic areas.
Yeah.
Depending on the availability of the data. And last year we looked at, one of the things we looked at was gender, right? So, well, not surprising, most think tanks are led by men. But there's a small group of think tanks led by women and a tiny group of think tanks led by both men and women. And so what we'll try to do year on year is keep track of this, right? Is this changing? This year, we're going to be looking at digital space and how think tanks in this directory are engaging with digital spaces and digital and technology. Because, as we all know, last year has forced many think tanks to engage digitally where they were not, right? Yeah. So the State of the Sector gives us a chance to see how the sector is doing as a whole. And the second publication we have, which comes up in April, is what we call an annual review. So it's a forward-looking publication. We pick a subject that we think is emerging in the field. We are, we're in constant conversation with think tanks, and we kind of pick up the keywords. And this last year, it was think tanks and change. So the publication was about change, how change happens, how change affects think tanks, and how think tanks can affect change. The previous year was on technology. The year before that, I think, was on engagement. So, and what we do for this publication is we ask think tank leaders and think tank thinkers and just people in the field to write about what they think the future in this subject will be and what we should be paying attention to. So those are two publications that are coming up. And I, they are both, they're not just us writing about what we think, but they're both publications that involve the voices and the views of the people that engage with us in the think tank space. So it's not just on think tanks writing, but it's more the on think tanks community writing about these issues.
What is the what's the theme for this year?
Well, we haven't decided yet.
Okay.
What's going to probably happen is that we will, email our, send a newsletter out and ask the question. Ask our audience what you think. What's coming up. What might be an issue to discuss, to address, and we'll figure it out over the next few months. As a community.
I just wonder if pandemic's going to have any impact on that thing.
Well, the subject change, had to do with the pandemic, but we didn't want to focus only on the pandemic, right? I think the pandemic has been a sudden change and it's also ushered change. Yeah. And so we wanted to talk about change rather than just the pandemic, but many of the articles are about the pandemic, right? Many of the articles.
Yeah. And I was going to say, just because we're further along now in some places, like in the United States, like where I am, we're back to normal now. So, that transition back, while still there are other continents, whole continents and countries that are dealing with another wave or the forthcoming of another wave of some variant maybe of what's going on here. So I don't know, maybe the transition and what that looks like, and what, my big thing is preparation and prevention. of what, because I live in a hurricane prone zone, so I understand. I'm FEMA trained and all that. We all have to be around here. But to understand how you use what you've learned and move forward, because this can't be the only time in the span of the next 25, 50 years that we don't have something that we're going to deal with that's going to be fairly catastrophic. I hope not, I pray not, but it's a planet, it's a world with a bunch of people. So
I think you're right. And the subject of building back better, the subject of sort of reimagining how we might, deal with these issues in the future is something that is going to be of interest to many things.
Really hard to prepare for things. It's really funny. I was interviewing a gal, I want to say she was in Sweden, and she worked in impact work, and it was right in the middle of the pandemic, the hardest part of it. And honestly, she wasn't wearing a mask or anything. And I was asking her how they were getting along with it. And the funny thing is, she says, we've been prepared for this all along. We knew how we were going to be because we've been being it every day. So it didn't hit us as hard. So I thought, well, that was kind of interesting, the way that she approached that there was no, sense of urgency about doing something. But because they had been doing a lot of it all along. I ran into some other gentleman who said, the mask situation where I came from, we were wearing it every day anyway when we went out. So it wasn't that big a deal. I'm like, really? Where did you come from? Somewhere in Vietnam. So interestingly enough. But I wanted to get to another publication that you had told me about before we went live here, was the manual on how to set up a think tank. Because now that we've talked about the different types, how they're funded and that sort of thing, and kind of maybe some of thematic approaches about how they might be able to structure themselves or how they should look at structuring themselves. You all have the know-how. You know how to tell them how to do it in maybe a really, I can't say simplistic way, because I don't think there's anything simple about a think tank, but how to maybe put themselves together in a way that's going to service them and whoever they service for the longer term. Sustainable is what I'm after there. So tell us a little bit about that.
So this manual is connected to another initiative we have, which is the School for Think Tankers. So every year we convene 30 or so young or future think tank leaders in what we call School for Think Tankers. And what we do is we bring either current or former directors of think tanks or directors of research, directors of communication, to share with this group of younger think tankers, to tell them what it is to be a director. What was my job about? Right? What are the challenges I had to face? What did I have to learn to do my job well? Because what we realize is that most people who lead think tanks and most people who want to set up a think tank, they're learning as they go. They learn by doing, right? Mm-hmm. Most directors of think tanks are researchers who are senior enough to become directors, right? That's usually what happens. You end up in this job. You realize, I don't know anything about organizational budgets or finance or fundraising or managing people. And what you do is that's what you need to do. You need to manage an organization. You're no longer doing research. Mm-hmm. And so we wanted to prepare the next generation of think tankers. And so we give them, the opportunity to talk to people who are doing the job or have done it. But we also give them a little bit of a nudge in terms of new ways of working, new business models, spur their imagination, because think tanks can't keep doing the same things they've always done. Mm-hmm. The manual is a way of supporting all of this. And instead of the School for Think Tankers does not give you a book, right, that you go through and, session one, not about that. Okay. So we normally do it face-to-face. We've done it in Geneva a few times. We're going to do it in London next. But now that we can't have people fly in from all the world, we're doing it online, but we'll be back in a face-to-face version soon. And what people come is with a blank sheet of paper, and they just collect information and they work with each other. They build their network. The manual, it's structured in a similar way. It's not, this is how you organize your board, or this is how you do your comms, or this is how you set up your team. Rather, it's a series of questions. So, what are you trying to achieve?
Yeah.
Right? What is your objective? Who are your audiences? Like, who do you think you're going to be working with? What do you want these audiences to do? who's going to work in this organization? Who's going to fund this organization? How are they going to fund this organization? Where are you going to get the people that are going to work in this organization? Are you going to build their skills, or are you going to, going to bring them already ready? What issues are you going to work on? What is going to be your approach to those issues? So it's a series of questions, and for each question, we offer options and answers and ways of finding out. And throughout the manual, this is in draft form. Throughout the manual, we say to people, you might not need a think tank. Right? You might be okay with a blog. You might be okay with a very active Twitter account. You might be okay with a campaign that starts and ends when you've achieved your objective. Mm-hmm. You might be okay with a research program in a university. That might be what you need to do, right? Because setting up and leading a think tank requires a huge commitment. We work with many people who are setting up think tanks, and the first thing we ask them is, who's going to lead this? Like, who's going to be the driving force behind this organization for the next 5 years, right? Not for the next 6 months, but for the next 5 years. Because you're going to have to convene advisors, you're going to have to convene researchers, you're going to have to convene funders, you're going to have to convene an audience, and you might have to do all of this without having the team set up, and without having all the money that you need to do the work, and without having clarity about what you're going to do. And so if you're doing something else, or if this is a bit of a hobby, I guarantee that this is not going to work. Yeah. So, so the manual is a way to accompany people who want to set up think tanks, but also individuals or groups that are already running a think tank and would like to, have a bit of a refresh about their idea, about their work. And the School for Think Tankers is something similar, right? We have people who come in because they want to start a think tank, or they want to learn about think tanks. And we also have people who are already in a think tank. Often they are in a mid-level to senior level position, and they want to have a refresh, and they want to think about what next for my organization and for myself. And those are two things that are coming. The manual, I think, will come out maybe in a couple of months, and then we'll be announcing a call for the School for Think Tankers, which takes place in January, February. People can sign up from September onwards, for sure.
Well, so other than people who might be interested in all of those publications and maybe jumping on your training there, your academy, what other types of people or partners, collaborators, types of people that you want to meet that is going to help what you're doing move forward?
Well, I mean, we are keen to hear from young think tankers. We have, I'll spend an extra time with anybody young researchers, young communicators who want to create something new, like a new model, new think tank, who want to explore. So I'd love to hear from new initiatives. We've been talking to a group of students in, I think, University of York that have a student think tank. Fantastic, right? So we'd like to hear more about that. We do work with some foundations, and we'd like to hear from more where what we do is we provide their grantees with support, right? So, a lot of foundations focus on a specific issue, right? Economic development, health, education, and they give money to organizations to do the research and advocate for change. We'd be more than happy to be able to support those organizations to do that work better, right? To be better at picking the right questions to study and deciding what's the best output and the best communication strategy to make sure that that research is actually used and paid attention to. And also, we would love to hear from in other sectors, like the private sector, who want to know more about think tanks, because we also think that there are, we have a project with IDRC, the Canadian Research Center, looking at think tanks and impact investors, for example. We think that think tanks can offer the impact investing sector huge amount of support, from helping change the policy frameworks in the country. So impact investing is, sustained in strong policies, to providing the founders and the investors with sound evidence of actual impact, because often impact there's a lot of impact washing in this sector. with just insights about the fields and the sectors that they're working in, right? So we want to connect think tanks locally, like local Peruvian think tanks or local Zambian think tanks or Nigerian think tanks with impact investors. So we'd like to hear from people who would like to know more about think tanks, and we would be more than happy to point them in the direction of good think tanks and help them understand how they might be able to work with them more efficiently, more effectively in the future as well.
Right.
And we think that it's going to help them, but it's also going to help the think tanks that we want to help.
Right. I almost feel like in some way you could be very, beneficial to people who are needing to collaborate with think tanks themselves. The partnership thing is being able to connect one to another or one entity to another. I sit on a governing board of a university in Nigeria, and I could see the potential for connecting like the university to a think tank, because this university is fairly new. But
there are excellent think tanks in Nigeria that we work with on a regular basis. And a colleague of mine said the other day, we our approach is we have no ego, right? Yeah. To some extent, we are, as I said, we are the infrastructure. We want to support the infrastructure, right? So we want the think tanks, local think tanks, we want those local think tanks to shine, right? We want their ideas to be heard. It's not going to be our idea, because that's not what we work on, right? We don't work on education policy in Nigeria, but we want the think tank to be able to do good research and to communicate that research in the best possible way. And I think that, to some extent, out of luck, it makes us a good intermediary, because we will happily pass on the connections and the links to those that we think are doing excellent work, and we'll be happy to help.
Excellent resource. You are an excellent resource to know. And I'm so tickled. So I think I'm going to be sending you emails after this, just to see where we might be able to kind of create some synergies with what you're doing and some of the different types of projects that we work in. We do a lot of work in Africa and around the world, but we do our own projects in Africa. So thank you. Thank you for everything that you're doing. Thank you for making it possible for people to get to a better place with the research and the way that they're putting it out, and maybe doing a better job with their think tanks, and also helping those people who might want to raise one up, from the ground up, and helping them start whatever they need to, or not start it if it's too much, which I would be in that category. So thank you again. I appreciate the time today, Enrique, and I'll be back in touch, and we'll be following you. There will be links we'll pop into the embed for frontrunnersinnovate.com. If you're seeing this on that platform, you'll look for the links below if you need to reach out to Enrique. And if you're seeing this on YouTube, we'll definitely have a link or two provided there where you can hop off and check out the website. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Enrique. Till next time.
Thank you very much.
All righty.